My house in Hillsborough always seemed too big for me. Even when Agatha was alive, we often discussed moving to something more compact, but we never made up our minds. Now that she's gone, the three bedrooms, study, and spacious living room with fireplace have become both a refuge and a prison for me. I, Gilbert Travers, 73 years old, a former district judge, am spending my days here, trying not to drown in memories. This morning, my knee started hurting again. Arthritis, a faithful companion of old age, reminds me of itself with every step. Overcoming the pain, I went downstairs, holding on to the dark oak banister that Agatha and I had chosen together 40 years ago. My cane, elegant with a silver handle, a gift from my colleagues upon my retirement, is now not just an accessory, but a necessity. The kitchen greeted me with rays of sunshine streaming through the large windows overlooking the garden. Agatha loved this garden. The roses she planted still bloom every summer, though not as profusely as they did when she was alive. The gardener comes twice a week, but I know he doesn't put his heart into his work. It's just a job for him, but for Agatha it was a passion. After making myself some tea, the only thing I've learned to cook properly over the years, I sat down at the kitchen table and opened the letter that the postman had brought yesterday. The clinic confirmed the date of my hip replacement surgery in 3 days. I waited for this moment with anxious impatience. The pain had become unbearable in recent months, but the thought of the hospital, anesthesia, and dependence on someone else's help caused a dull resistance in me. My gaze fell involuntarily on the recently installed camera in the corner of the kitchen. A small black device, almost invisible if you didn't know where to look. There are 8 such cameras in the house, 1 in each room and 2 outside. I never thought I would need a security system. Hillsborough is considered a safe neighborhood, but after a house on the next street was burglarized in broad daylight, I decided to play it safe. The system is connected to my tablet and phone. The app allows me to see what's happening in the house in real time, wherever I am. I like the idea of being able to control my space, even when I'm away from it. Perhaps this is a remnant of my career as a judge, the need to maintain order and justice in everything. 35 years on the bench is not just a job, it's a way of life. I handed down sentences based on facts in the law without giving in to emotions. This habit of impartiality has become so ingrained in me that I sometimes catch myself evaluating people and situations as if they were standing before me in a courtroom. Even my only son, Adrian. Adrian was always a smart boy, maybe too sensitive for my taste, but definitely smart. I expected him to follow in my footsteps, but he chose computer science. He became a programmer at some tech company. He earns well, as far as I can tell. But there has always been a certain distance between us, which has become increasingly difficult to overcome over the years. When Agatha died 5 years ago of cancer, that distance turned into a chasm. My wife was the bridge between us, smoothing out the rough edges and finding compromises. Without her, my son and I were like 2 magnets of the same polarity, repelling each other at any attempt to get closer. And then Pearl appeared. I remember the day Adrian brought her to meet me, a slender blonde with cold blue eyes and a smile that never reached those eyes. 20 years younger than my son. She is officially presented as a public relations consultant, but I still don't understand what exactly her responsibilities are. "Dad, this is Pearl Alliston," Adrian said then, and I noticed his gaze darting to her, seeking approval. "We've been dating for 6 months. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Travers," she said, extending her perfectly manicured hand. "Adrian has told me so much about you." I shook her hand, noting its firm grip, too firm for a woman of her build. "I hope nothing too compromising," I replied, trying to lighten the mood. Pearl smiled, but her eyes remained wary. At that moment, I felt her assessing me, not as the father of her beloved, but as an asset, a property, a potential obstacle or benefit. Perhaps my professional bias made me overly suspicious, but I had learned to trust my intuition. At dinner, she was impeccably polite. She asked the right questions, laughed in all the right places, and expressed admiration for my home. But something about her behavior seemed deliberate, as if she were playing a role she had carefully rehearsed. "Is that a family heirloom?" she asked, pointing to a silver candlestick on the mantelpiece. "Yes, it belonged to my grandmother," I replied. "How lovely," she said, and I noticed her gaze sliding over the other items in the room, as if mentally assessing their value. After that evening, they began to visit more often. Pearl was always polite and attentive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the way Adrian changed around her, becoming more tense, constantly seeking her approval, even changing his habits. He stopped wearing the sweaters he loved because Pearl thought they were old-fashioned. He stopped talking about books because she didn't like such heavy conversations. It was as if she was gradually erasing his personality, replacing it with a version that better suited her ideas. A year later, they got married. The wedding was lavish, with 300 guests, most of whom I didn't know. When Adrian asked if I could help finance the celebration, I agreed, even though the amount seemed excessive to me. But I wanted my son to be happy, and I hoped that my dislike of Pearl was just an old man's prejudice that time would dispel. Time did not dispel anything. On the contrary, with each visit, I became more and more convinced that this marriage was a mistake. Pearl constantly talked about money, about the new car they were planning to buy, the house they wanted to build, the trips she dreamed of taking. Adrian nodded and smiled like a zombie. I didn't recognize my son in this man who was willing to do anything to win his wife's approval. Our relationship finally broke down after my 70th birthday. Adrian and Pearl threw a party for me, again with guests who were mostly their friends, not mine. At the end of the evening, when we were alone, Pearl brought up my will. "Gilbert," she said, addressing me by name for the first time, "I know this is a sensitive subject, but have you thought about the future? What will happen to this house, to your property?" I remember how tense Adrian, who was sitting next to her, became. He gave her a warning look, which she ignored. "I believe it is better to discuss such matters in advance to avoid misunderstandings," she continued with the same cold smile. "After all, Adrian is your only son." "Yes," I replied, trying to remain calm. "Adrian is my only son, and I'm sure he wouldn't discuss my will at my birthday party." Adrian blushed and began to mumble apologies. Pearl, however, did not show the slightest embarrassment. "I'm sorry if I touched on a sensitive subject," she said, but there was no sincerity in her voice. "I just wanted to make sure everything was okay. These days there are so many cases where inheritances are contested, lawsuits arise." "I'm a former judge, Pearl," I interrupted her. "I know perfectly well how to draw up a legally sound will." That ended the conversation, but from then on there was open animosity between us. Pearl stopped pretending, and I stopped pretending to approve of the marriage. Adrian was caught between two fires and, of course, chose his wife's side. Our meetings became less frequent and shorter. Phone calls were formal and tense. The last time I saw them together was at Christmas. They arrived late, stayed for only 2 hours, and left immediately after exchanging gifts. Pearl gave me a scarf, expensive, but not my style at all. I gave them a gift certificate for dinner at a restaurant. After they left, I discovered that my grandmother's silver candlestick had disappeared from the mantelpiece. I didn't call to ask about it. I was too tired of conflict. 7 months have passed since then. Adrian called several times, always when Pearl wasn't around. The conversations were awkward, full of uncomfortable pauses. He never mentioned the candlestick, and I didn't ask. I informed him of the upcoming surgery by email 2 weeks ago. I received a short reply. "Get well, Dad. Let me know if you need any help." Not a word about coming to visit me in the hospital, but then I didn't expect him to. I finished my tea and looked at my watch. It was almost noon. It was time to take my medication. I took the container of pills sorted by day of the week out of the cabinet and swallowed my daily dose with some water. Then I checked the camera app on my tablet. Everything was working fine. 8 small windows showed the empty rooms of my house. I liked this system, simple but effective. The technician who installed it offered more sophisticated options: motion sensors, alarms, connection to a security agency. But I just needed to see what was going on in my house, especially now that I was going to be away for several weeks. I put down my tablet and picked up the newspaper. The front page featured an article about rising crime in neighboring areas. Yet another confirmation that the cameras were the right decision. At my age, a sense of security becomes one of the most important needs. And control. Control over my space, my property, my life. Perhaps that is why Pearl's attempts to interfere in my affairs annoy me so much. I have lived a long life, made difficult decisions, handed down sentences that changed people's fates. And now, at the end of this journey, I want to be in charge of what belongs to me. I turned on the TV and settled into my favorite chair. There was a documentary about World War II. I watched the footage, the faces of the soldiers, many of whom were no older than 20, and thought about how quickly time flies. These young people are now old men like me, and many are already gone, like Agatha. Sometimes I think I hear her footsteps on the second floor or smell her perfume in the hallway, but it's just my memory playing tricks on me, longing for a time that can never be returned. Tomorrow I have my last visit to the doctor before the operation. I'll need to call a taxi, as it's getting harder and harder to drive myself. And then 3 days of packing and preparation. I'll have to check that all the documents are in order. The will is kept in a safe in my office, with a duplicate at my lawyer's. I haven't changed it since Agatha died. According to it, Adrian gets the house and most of my savings, with the remainder distributed among several charities that Agatha supported. Perhaps it's time to revise some of the clauses. Not out of revenge, but out of common sense. I'm not sure Adrian will be able to resist Pearl's influence when it comes to the inheritance. And this house means too much to me to imagine her disposing of it as she sees fit. But that can wait until I return from the hospital. Right now, I feel too tired to make such decisions. Turning off the TV, I got up, leaning on my cane, and slowly made my way to the stairs. Every step sent a jolt of pain through my hip. The operation was necessary, no matter how much I resisted the idea. Reaching the second floor, I stopped at the door to the bedroom that Agatha and I had shared for 38 years. Now I sleep there alone, on my half of the bed, as if leaving room for her. Sometimes at night I talk to her, telling her about my day, about my thoughts. Perhaps this is a sign of loneliness or the onset of dementia, but I feel like she is listening. "The operation is coming soon, Agatha," I whispered, looking at her photo on the bedside table. "I hope everything goes well." Of course, the photo didn't answer. Only the dust dancing in the rays of the afternoon sun shining through the curtains created the illusion of movement. I lay down, fully clothed, on top of the blanket. Fatigue came over me suddenly, as it often does at my age. Closing my eyes, I thought about what awaited me in the coming weeks, about the hospital, about rehabilitation, about returning to this too big, too quiet house, and about the fact that perhaps the time had come for serious changes. The hospital ward greeted me with sterile whiteness and the smell of antiseptic. The private clinic, for which I had paid a hefty sum, offered every amenity imaginable in a medical facility: a private room with a TV, an adjustable bed, a view of a well-tended garden from the window. But none of this could compensate for the feeling of helplessness that overwhelmed me after the operation. I nodded, feeling the painkillers gradually wearing off, giving way to a dull throbbing pain at the site of the operation. "When can I go home?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "If there are no complications, in 10 to 14 days, Dr. Pearson replied. "But you'll need help. Do you have someone who can look after you at first?" I thought about my empty house, about the fact that my only son lived 2 hours away and was unlikely to be eager to take care of me. "I'll hire a nurse," I replied curtly. Dr. Pearson nodded without insisting. He must have been used to people like me, old people who desperately cling to their independence. "In that case, we'll find you a good home care service," he said. "In the meantime, rest and follow all the staff's instructions." After he left, I stared out the window for a long time at the patch of sky between the hospital buildings. There the clouds floated by, carefree and free, unlike me, chained to this bed, dependent on the help of others even for the most basic actions. The first few days after the operation merged into one endless stream of pain, sleep, and waking up from injections and procedures. Nurses came in and out of the room, checking IVs, measuring blood pressure, helping me turn from side to side. I hated this dependence, this invasion of my personal space, but I had no choice. On the third day, they started to get me out of bed. The physical therapist, an energetic woman named Rose, was adamant. All my life, I had been proud of my endurance, and I wasn't about to change that now. Step by step, inch by inch, we walked down the hallway and back. Every movement required incredible effort, but I didn't give up. By the end of the session, I was drenched in sweat and could barely stand, but I felt a strange satisfaction. I could still overcome difficulties. I was still capable of fighting. "Great job, Mr. Travers," Rose praised me. "Tomorrow we'll try to walk to the end of the corridor and back." I nodded, too exhausted to speak, and let the nurse help me back into bed. The next few days followed the same pattern. Morning rounds, procedures, physical therapy, lunch rest, more physical therapy, dinner, evening medications, sleep. The monotony of hospital life weighed on me, but I tried to keep my mind sharp by reading the books I had brought with me and checking the news on my tablet. It was through my tablet that I checked the cameras in my house. Everything was quiet and peaceful. Empty rooms, frozen in anticipation of my return. This routine check became a kind of ritual for me, a connection to my real world outside the hospital walls. On the fifth day after the operation, Adrian visited me. He entered the ward holding a bouquet, a standard set of chrysanthemums and carnations that you can buy at any supermarket. His hair was neatly combed back, and his thin-rimmed glasses gave him that intelligent look that I always associated with self-doubt. In a suit that Pearl had obviously chosen, dark blue with a fashionable narrow tie, he looked like a stranger. "Hi, Dad," he said, placing the flowers on the bedside table. "How are you feeling?" I tried to sit up, wincing in pain. "Fine," I replied. "The doctors say everything is going according to plan." Adrian nodded, looking around as if assessing my living conditions. "Nice room, spacious." "For the money, I expected something like this," I remarked. There was an awkward pause. Adrian sat down on a chair next to the bed, his hands resting on his knees. His fingers tapped nervously on the fabric of his pants. "Pearl sends her regards," he said finally. "She wanted to come, but she has an important meeting with a client." I nodded, not believing a word of it. Pearl had no desire to see me, and the feeling was mutual. "How's your renovation coming along?" I asked, more out of politeness than genuine interest. Adrian's face lit up. "Almost finished. The kitchen looks amazing. You should see the marble countertops we chose. And the bedroom now has a walk-in closet, just like Pearl wanted." He spoke about his house with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen in him in a long time. Perhaps it was one of the few topics we could discuss without tension. "Sounds impressive," I said. "Must have cost a pretty penny." Adrian tensed slightly. "Well, we both earn good money," he replied evasively, "and it's an investment in the future." I didn't pursue the subject. Financial matters had always been slippery ground in our conversations, especially after Pearl came into his life. "Speaking of the future," Adrian continued, his voice taking on that particular tone I had heard in the courtroom from lawyers preparing to ask an uncomfortable question. "I thought you might need some help after you're discharged. Maybe you should stay with us for a while. The second bedroom is almost ready and—" I raised my hand to stop him. "Thank you for the offer, but I've already arranged for a caregiver. I'll be more comfortable recovering in my own home." Adrian nodded, agreeing too quickly. I realized that the offer was just a formality and that he was glad I had declined. "As you wish," he said, "but if you change your mind—" "I won't change my mind," I said, perhaps too sharply. Then softening my tone, I added, "I appreciate your concern, but I'll be better off at home." Adrian nodded again and looked out the window. Another pause ensued, filled with unspoken words and old grievances. "Speaking of home," he said suddenly, as if the thought had just occurred to him, although I felt that the conversation had been deliberately leading up to this. "I noticed you have security cameras installed. That's something new." "Yes, I had them installed a month ago," I replied. "After that robbery on Maple Street, I decided to play it safe." Adrian raised his eyebrows. "A sensible precaution," he said, "but you always said Hillsborough was a safe neighborhood." "Times change," I replied dryly. "I prefer to be aware of what's going on in my house, even when I'm not there." Adrian frowned slightly. "How does it work? Do you get alerts when someone enters?" "No, I can just check the recordings or watch in real time through the app." I pointed to the tablet lying on the nightstand. Adrian nodded, and I thought I saw a shadow of concern flash across his face. "Did you give the house keys to anyone else?" he asked, trying to make his voice sound casual, but I could hear the tension in every word. "No, just you," I replied, watching his reaction closely. "For emergencies." "Why do you ask?" Adrian shrugged, avoiding my gaze. "Just checking, just in case you need anything from home while you're here." I felt suspicion growing inside me. These questions about cameras, about keys, something wasn't right here. "If I need anything, I'll ask the nurse to call you," I said. "But for now, I have everything I need." Adrian nodded, clearly wanting to change the subject. How are your documents? Everything in order? Insurance? Powers of attorney? There it was. The question he had been leading up to the whole conversation. Everything is in order, I replied evenly. The documents are stored in a safe place, accessible if necessary. Okay, Adrian said too quickly. I just want to be sure that if something happens, I can help. If something happens, I replied, emphasizing each word, my lawyer has all the necessary instructions. Adrian nodded, lowering his eyes. His face showed disappointment, which he tried to hide. Of course, Dad, I'm just worried about you. Worried about me or about my will? I wanted to ask if Pearl had put him up to prying information about my documents, but I held back. A direct accusation would only exacerbate the tension between us. I have to go, Adrian said suddenly, looking at his watch. I have a meeting in an hour, but I'll stop by in a few days to see how you're doing. He stood up, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot, as if unsure how to say goodbye. In the end, he just patted me on the shoulder, a gesture that seemed strange and formal to me. Get well, Dad, and let me know if you need anything. Sure, I replied. Thanks for coming by. He nodded and headed for the door, but stopped at the threshold. By the way, where do you keep the spare house key, just in case you lose yours? The question sounded so deliberately casual that I instantly became alert. In the safe, I replied briefly. Same place as all the important documents. Adrian nodded as if confirming his thoughts. I see. Well, get well soon. With that, he left, leaving me alone with a growing sense of unease. Something was definitely wrong here. Adrian had never been interested in my finances or documents, and these questions about keys, about cameras, too many coincidences for simple concern for my well-being. I picked up my tablet and opened the camera app. Everything was as usual, empty rooms, silence. But now that silence seemed tense, expectant. Day turned to evening, and my anxiety wouldn't let go. The nurse brought dinner, which I barely touched, and my evening medication, which I took automatically. My thoughts kept returning to Adrian's strange questions and what might be behind them. The night in the hospital is never completely quiet. The constant sounds, the footsteps of the staff in the hallway, the beeping of equipment, the moans of other patients, create a background that is difficult to get used to. But on this night, even these familiar noises could not distract me from my disturbing thoughts. I lay there staring at the ceiling, going over the details of today's conversation with my son in my head. His interest in cameras, keys, documents, it all added up to a picture I didn't want to see, but couldn't ignore. It was well past midnight when I picked up my tablet again. I'll just check the cameras one more time, I thought, before trying to sleep. I opened the app and started looking through the images from different cameras. The living room was empty. The kitchen was empty. The hallway, I froze, feeling my heart start to beat faster. On the screen, I saw the front door of my house open and a figure enter. In the dim light of the nightlight I always left on in the hallway, I recognized Pearl. She was wearing a dark coat and moving confidently, like someone who knows exactly where she's going. She was holding a key in her hand, the one I thought only Adrian had for emergencies. I stared at the tablet screen, unable to believe my eyes. Pearl was standing in the hallway of my house, looking around as if listening to the silence of the empty space. I instinctively leaned forward, ignoring the pain in my operated hip, completely absorbed by what was happening on the screen. Pearl took off her coat and hung it neatly on a hanger. She was wearing a strict dark blue suit, business attire that seemed to lend legitimacy to her intrusion. She fixed her hair in front of the mirror in the hallway, then with a determined look on her face headed deeper into the house. I switched between cameras, following her movements. Here she is walking through the living room, not even glancing at the family photos on the mantelpiece. Here she is climbing the stairs, holding onto the same dark oak banister that I had struggled to descend before leaving for the hospital. Her heels tapped softly on the wooden steps, a sound that the camera barely picked up, but which I could imagine with frightening clarity. On the second floor, she turned without hesitation toward my study. Not the bedroom, not the guest room. She knew exactly where she was going. I switched to the camera in my study, feeling nausea rising in my throat, a mixture of anger and disgust at this unceremonious intrusion. My study had always been my sanctuary. Even Agatha rarely entered it without invitation. And now Pearl was standing in the middle of the room, Surveying the bookshelves filled with legal literature and memoirs, my massive mahogany desk, the leather chair in which I had spent countless hours working on complex cases or simply reading. Pearl walked over to the desk and, without the slightest hesitation, began opening the drawers. Methodically, one by one, she checked their contents. She pulled out folders with documents, looked through them, and put them back. Her face remained focused, but I noticed a shadow of disappointment when another drawer did not contain what she was looking for. Finished with the desk, she moved on to the filing cabinet. Again, the same methodical approach. She pulled out a drawer, looked through its contents, closed it, and moved on to the next one. There was no haste or nervousness in her actions, only cold calculation. This suggested that she felt completely safe, confident that no one would disturb her in the near future. I felt my heart begin to beat faster. Had Adrian told her that he had visited me, that he had asked about the cameras? Surely. Otherwise, she would not have been so confident that I would not see her intrusion. The thought that my own son had betrayed me was more painful than any physical pain I was experiencing. After searching the closet to no avail, Pearl stopped in the middle of the room, put her hands on her hips, and looked around with obvious irritation. Then her gaze fell on a painting hanging on the wall, a landscape by a local artist that concealed a safe. I saw her eyes narrow and a triumphant smile appear on her face. She walked over to the painting, took it off the wall, and placed it on a chair. In front of her was my safe, a simple metal box built into the wall with a combination lock. Pearl studied the safe for a few seconds, then took out her phone and dialed a number. I couldn't hear the conversation. The camera didn't record sound, but I could tell from her lips that she was talking to Adrian. She gestured toward the safe, clearly asking for the combination. After a brief conversation, she put the phone away and began entering numbers on the keypad. Judging by her exasperated sigh, her first attempt was unsuccessful. She took out her phone again, apparently to confirm the combination. I felt a pang of bitterness. Adrian was trying to guess the code. Perhaps he was suggesting my birthday, or his, or the anniversary of my marriage to Agatha. After the third call, Pearl finally managed to open the safe. Apparently, Adrian remembered that I could have used Agatha's date of death, June 23rd, as the password. It wasn't sentimentality on my part, but rather practicality, a date that was impossible to forget. Pearl began to remove the contents of the safe, a stack of documents, a box of Agatha's jewelry that I had kept for future generations, and several envelopes of cash that I had kept for emergencies. She quickly glanced through the documents, setting aside the folder with the will, and then became interested in the box. Opening it, Pearl spent a few seconds examining the contents. A pearl necklace I had given Agatha on our 20th wedding anniversary, diamond earrings she had inherited from her mother, several rings, bracelets. Nothing incredibly valuable from a financial point of view, but each item had enormous sentimental value for me. I watched anxiously as she sorted through the jewelry, examining each piece appraisingly. To my relief, she put the box back in its place and focused on the documents. I saw her open the folder with the will and begin to read. Her face first showed concentration, then confusion, and then disappointment. She flipped through the pages faster and faster, obviously looking for something that wasn't there. At one point, she took out her phone again and started talking, probably to Adrian, occasionally pointing at the documents and shaking her head. After the conversation, she put the papers back in the safe, but did not close it, as if she intended to return later. Then she left the office, and I switched to other cameras to follow her. Pearl headed purposefully toward my bedroom. I felt a tightening inside. This was too personal an intrusion. The bedroom I shared with Agatha contained the most intimate memories of our life together. And now this woman, with her cold blue eyes and calculating mind, was entering it as if she had every right to do so. In the bedroom, Pearl immediately headed for the bedside tables. She opened the drawer on my side of the bed and found my personal diary, a simple black book with a leather cover. I started keeping it after Agatha's death, writing down thoughts I couldn't express aloud, reflections on life and death, observations about the people around me, including, of course, Adrian and Pearl. I watched as she sat down on the edge of my bed, the bed where Agatha had died, and opened the diary, beginning to read. Her face gradually changed, expressing first curiosity, then surprise, then shock. and finally anger. I remembered exactly what I had written about her in the diary. How I thought she was calculating and cold. How I worried that she was manipulating Adrian, changing him, erasing everything that made him like me or Agatha. How I suspected that she was only interested in the money and status she had gained by marrying the only son of a former district judge. There were also entries about our conflicts, about the time she asked about my will right at my 70th birthday party, about how I noticed the disappearance of a silver candlestick after their last visit, but didn't make a fuss because I was tired of constant conflicts. Pearl turned the pages faster and faster, pausing at certain entries, her face darkening with anger. At one point, she slammed the diary shut and clenched it in her hands so hard that her knuckles turned white. I saw her dial a number on the phone, Adrian's no doubt, and start talking, waving the diary around. Her face expressed a mixture of anger, wounded pride, and, to my surprise, hurt. It was as if my notes had really hurt her, as if she had hoped that I thought better of her than I had written. After the conversation, Pearl put the diary in her purse. She was going to take it with her and return to the study. I switched the camera back on, watching her close the safe and hang the painting back in its place. Then she began to tidy up everything she had touched, returning things to exactly the position they had been in. This spoke of cold-bloodedness and calculation. She didn't want me to notice her intrusion when I returned from the hospital. If it weren't for the cameras, I probably would never have known she was here. When she was done in the study, she went back to the bedroom and straightened the bedspread where she had been sitting to cover up any traces of her presence. The only thing she didn't do was put the diary back where it belonged. It was now in her purse. Perhaps she thought I wouldn't notice it right away when I got back from the hospital. I watched her go down the stairs, walk through the living room, and stop at the photo on the mantelpiece. The only one that showed Agatha, Adrian, and me together, taken at Adrian's college graduation. For a moment, her face softened, and I thought I saw something like regret in it. But the moment passed, and the cold mask returned. Pearl put on her coat, glanced around the hallway once more to make sure everything looked untouched, and left, carefully locking the door behind her. I put down my tablet, feeling a strange mixture of emotions: anger, disappointment, resentment, but also a kind of grim satisfaction. Now I knew for sure that my suspicions about Pearl weren't just the paranoia of an old man. She really was exactly what I thought she was: calculating, selfish, willing to break into someone else's home for financial gain. But the most painful thing was realizing Adrian's role in all this. My only son, my flesh and blood in Agatha's, didn't just allow his wife to search my house. He actively helped her, trying to guess the combination to the safe, probably giving her the key. And all the while he sat at my hospital bed with a bouquet of cheap flowers, he was already planning this invasion. Suddenly I realized that the ward had become very quiet. Even the usual hospital sounds, the footsteps of the staff, the beeping of the equipment, seemed muffled, as if the whole world had frozen, waiting for my reaction to what I had seen. What should I do? Call Adrian and tell him everything I thought about him and his wife? Report the illegal intrusion to the police? Pretend I hadn't seen anything and continue to play the role of a naive old man, unaware of his own family's betrayal? I looked out the window at the hospital garden, where several patients in robes were slowly walking along the paths, leaning on walkers or the arms of their companions. Soon I would have to join them. The first stage of rehabilitation included daily walks in the fresh air, but now the physical pain from the operation seemed insignificant compared to the emotional pain of betrayal. There was a knock at the door, and a nurse entered with a tray of medication. "Time for your pain medication, Mr. Travers," she said with a smile. "How are you feeling today?" "I felt better," I replied, taking the pills. "When is Dr. Pearson making his rounds?" "After lunch," said the nurse, checking the IV. "Do you have any questions for him?" "Yes," I said. "I want to clarify when I can go home. There are circumstances that require my presence." The nurse nodded without asking any further questions. "I'll let him know," she said, and left, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I picked up my tablet again and opened the camera app. The house was empty, just as it had been before Pearl's intrusion. But now the emptiness felt desecrated, violated. The place I considered my refuge had been defiled by a stranger's presence, by hands that had rummaged through my personal belongings. I had to act, and act quickly. Pearl had taken my diary, perhaps to show Adrian, perhaps to use against me in some way. What else could she have taken that I hadn't noticed? What else were she and Adrian planning? Suddenly, I realized they might return. Now that they knew the contents of my will, they might decide they wanted something else from the house. Perhaps the nurse nodded and brought me the hospital phone. I dialed the number of Walter Kingsley, my lawyer and old friend, with whom I had worked when I was a judge. "Walter," I said when he answered, "it's Gilbert. I need your help. Urgently." "Gilbert?" His voice sounded surprised. "I thought you were in the hospital after your surgery." "I am," I replied, "but something has happened that requires immediate attention. Can you come over today?" "Of course," Walter said. "What happened?" I briefly explained the situation to him, how Pearl broke into my house, searched it, found my diary and took it, how Adrian helped her by giving her the key and helping with the safe combination. "Damn it," Walter cursed, which was unusual for the normally reserved lawyer. "Are you sure it was her, and that Adrian was in on it?" "I have the surveillance footage," I replied. "It's crystal clear. She was talking to him on the phone right in my house, asking for advice about the safe combination." Walter paused, digesting the information. "What do you want to do?" he finally asked. "Change the will," I replied without hesitation. "I want you to bring all the necessary documents. And I also need you to contact the security company and ask them to change the locks on the house. Immediately." "Consider it done," Walter said. "I'll be with you in 2 hours." I thanked him and hung up, feeling a strange sense of relief. The decision had been made, and now I knew what I had to do. Years spent on the bench had taught me to act decisively when the situation demanded it. And now, while Walter was on his way to me, I could prepare a list of changes I wanted to make to the will. It took me some time to formulate everything clearly and legally correctly, but when I finished, I felt the satisfaction of a man who had made the right decision. Shocked by the invasion of my personal space and thoughts, I was ready to act. Walter Kingsley arrived at the hospital exactly 2 hours after our phone call, as promised. I had always appreciated his punctuality, a trait that is increasingly rare these days. He entered the room carrying a leather briefcase that seemed unchanged since we first met 40 years ago. "Gilbert," he said, shaking my hand and studying me intently with the gaze of an experienced lawyer accustomed to assessing the condition of his clients. "You look better than I expected, considering the circumstances." "Anger is a great stimulant, Walter," I replied, trying to sit up higher in bed. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Walter placed his briefcase on the bedside table and sat down on a chair next to the bed. In his early 70s, he remained fit and energetic, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and clear gray eyes that seemed to see right through people. "You mentioned the camera footage," he said, getting straight to the point. "Can you show me?" I took my tablet and opened the camera app, selecting the saved recording of yesterday's intrusion. We watched the entire episode in silence, from the moment Pearl entered the house to her departure with my diary. Walter's face remained impassive, but I noticed his jaw tense when he saw Pearl rummaging through my safe. "Definitely trespassing," he said when the recording ended. "Given that Walter, in the current version, he gets the house and 70% of my savings. I want to reduce his share to 30%. The rest should go to charity, to the foundations that Agatha supported." Walter raised an eyebrow but showed no other emotion. "And the house?" "Sell it," I replied without hesitation. "After my death, the proceeds should also go to charity. I don't want Pearl to get anything that belonged to me and Agatha." Walter nodded, taking notes in his notebook. "What about Agatha's jewelry?" I thought for a moment. Those things had enormous sentimental value to me. I had kept them for grandchildren I never had. "Perhaps they should be donated to a museum," I finally said, "on the condition that they are displayed with Agatha's name mentioned." "A sensible decision," Walter agreed. "Anything else?" "Yes," I said. "I want to include a clause about the diary. If it is not returned to me within a month after the will is read, Adrian's share will be reduced by another 10%. And I want to add an explanation of the reasons for these changes, so that Adrian knows that this is not a whim or senility, but a direct consequence of his actions." Walter made a few more notes, then looked at me with that special expression I had seen in the courtroom when he was preparing to ask a witness a difficult question. "Gilbert, are you sure you want to do this? Adrian is your only son. This decision will irrevocably change your relationship." I smiled bitterly. "Our relationship has already changed irrevocably, Walter. The moment he gave his wife the keys to my house and helped her search it while I lay here helpless. I cannot forgive such betrayal. Walter sighed and nodded, acknowledging the fairness of my words. All right, he said. I'll prepare a new version of the will according to your instructions. I'll be back tomorrow with the documents for signing. We'll need witnesses. I can bring my assistant, but we'll need someone else. Ask Dr. Pearson, I suggested. I think he'll agree. Agreed, Walter said, closing his notebook. What about the locks? Would you like me to take care of that? Yes, please, I nodded. And one more request. Take Agatha's photos from my house. I don't want them to remain there if Adrian or Pearl decide to return. Of course, my thoughts were far away, returning to the past, to the days when Adrian was a little boy who looked at me with boundless admiration. Where did I go wrong? When did our paths begin to diverge so much that it led to such betrayal? Perhaps it all started in his childhood, when I was too busy with my career to give him enough attention. Or in his teenage years when I was too strict, demanding that he live up to my high standards. Agatha always said I was too harsh on the boy. He's not you, Gilbert, she would say. He has his own path, his own talents. Let him find himself. But I insisted that discipline and high expectations were the best way to raise a strong person. I demanded that Adrian get perfect grades, participate in the same sports I had played at his age, and take an interest in law, which was my passion. When he chose computer science over law, I took it as a personal insult, as a rejection of family tradition, as proof of his weakness. We had a falling out, the only time Adrian ever openly defied me. I don't want to be like you, Dad, he said then, his voice trembling, but his eyes filled with determination. I don't want to spend my life listening to other people's problems and passing judgment. I want to create something new, something useful. I called him naive and ungrateful. I said he was disappointing not only me, but all our ancestors who had proudly served the law. I saw the pain in his eyes, but I was too proud to back down. Since then, an invisible wall has risen between us. We communicated politely but distantly. Agatha tried to build a bridge between us, but to no avail. I was too stubborn, and Adrian was too hurt. When he married his first wife, a quiet, intelligent girl named Helen, I couldn't hide my disappointment that she was the daughter of a simple mechanic and not from our circle. The marriage lasted only 3 years. Adrian never talked about it, but I suspected that my disapproval played a part in their divorce. And then Pearl came along, with her ambition, her calculation, and her materialistic values. I saw her immediately as a gold digger, but Adrian was blinded. Or worse, he chose her to spite me, knowing she embodied everything I despised. Maybe it was his revenge, a subconscious desire to hit me where it hurt the most, to choose a woman who was the complete opposite of the values I had tried to instill in him. These thoughts were painful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the toxicity of our relationship with our son was largely the result of my own harshness and inability to accept him for who he was. Agatha understood this. In the last years of her life, she often said to me, Gilbert, be gentler. Life is too short for pride and unforgiveness. But even for her sake, I couldn't bring myself to do it. And now here we are. My son and his wife are ransacking my house while I'm in the hospital, looking for money and valuables. My thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. A nurse entered. Mr. Travers, you have a visitor, your son. I tensed, not expecting this visit. Was it a coincidence, or had Adrian somehow found out that I had seen the Pearl invasion? I mentally prepared myself for a difficult conversation. Let him in, I said, trying to keep my voice normal. Adrian entered, and I immediately noticed that he was nervous. He was pale, his eyes darting around, avoiding my gaze. Instead of the bouquet he had brought last time, he was holding only a small box of chocolates. Hi, Dad, he said, placing the chocolates on the nightstand. How are you feeling? Better, I replied curtly. The doctors say your recovery is going well. Adrian nodded, still avoiding my gaze. That's good. I'm glad. There was an awkward pause. I made no attempt to ease the task for him, simply waiting for him to continue. Listen, Dad, he finally began, nervously fingering the edge of his jacket. Pearl and I, well, there's something I wanted to talk to you about. I'm listening, I said, keeping a straight face. Adrian took a deep breath, as if gathering his courage. I know our relationship hasn't been perfect in recent years, especially after Mom died. And I know you don't particularly like Pearl. I waited silently to see where he was going with this. But I want you to know that we really love each other, and she cares about me, even if you don't think so. I almost smiled at the bitter irony of the situation. He was clearly trying to prepare me for the confession that they had found my diary, but he wanted to do it without revealing that Pearl had broken into my house. Adrian, I said, seeing no point in continuing this charade, what's all this talk about? If you have something to say it directly. He flinched, then nodded, acknowledging that I was right. Okay, he said, his voice firming. The thing is, we found your diary. Found it? I asked, raising an eyebrow. And where did you find it? Adrian blushed, clearly unprepared for the direct question. It, it doesn't matter. What matters is that I read what you wrote in it. About us, Pearl and me. And what did I write, Adrian? I asked, watching him shift uncomfortably in his chair. You wrote terrible things about her, he said, his voice tinged with hurt. That she married me for money. That she manipulates me. That she is Pearl pregnant? No, not yet, he replied quickly. But we're planning to be. And it hurts me to think that my child will grow up knowing that his grandfather despises his mother. I looked at my son, trying to see in him the boy I once knew. Honest, straightforward, with a strong sense of justice. But that boy was no longer there. Sitting in front of me was a grown man capable of lying to his own father's face to protect a woman who had stolen from his home. Adrian, I said slowly, I want you to answer me honestly. How did you get my diary? He nervously licked his lips. I already told you. We found it. Where? I insisted. Where exactly did you find it? In the closet, he said uncertainly. When we were packing your things for the hospital. I shook my head, feeling disappointment welling up inside me. Adrian, I never asked you to pack my things for the hospital. I had a small bag with me with the essentials, which I packed myself before leaving, and my diary was always in the drawer of my bedside table, not in the closet. Adrian turned pale, realizing he had been caught lying. I meant the nightstand, he tried to correct himself. We were looking for your glasses, thinking you might have forgotten them, and we accidentally found the diary. I don't wear glasses, Adrian, I said quietly, and you know that very well. Adrian fell silent, not knowing what to say. His lie was falling apart before my eyes. Dad, Enough, I interrupted him. I don't want to hear any more lies. I know Pearl was in my house last night. I know she searched it, found my diary and took it. And I know Adrian sat stunned, unable to utter a word. Why, Adrian? I asked, my voice not so much angry as tired and disappointed. Why did you do this? We didn't mean any harm, he finally said, his voice trembling. Pearl just wanted to know what you really thought of us. She sensed your dislike, but didn't understand why. And I wanted to make sure your will was in order, in case something happened to you during the operation. And for that you had to break into my safe? I asked. Steal my personal diary? Adrian, you do realize that's illegal, don't you? That I could report it to the police? You wouldn't do that, he said, and for the first time, there was a challenge in his voice. I wouldn't make our family problems public. Don't be so sure, I replied. After what you've done, I'm not sure I can call you family. Adrian flinched as if I had hit him. Don't say that, Dad. We made a mistake, but we're still your family, the only family you have left. Families don't betray each other, Adrian, I said. Family doesn't break into a house while a loved one is in the hospital, search through their belongings and steal personal records. Those aren't the actions of a loving son. Those are the actions of someone who is only interested in money and property. That's not true, Adrian exclaimed. Yes, we did the wrong thing. Yes, we shouldn't have entered your house without permission. But we were worried about you, about your health, about your future. There was some truth in his words, and it stung me. I had been harsh with him, perhaps too harsh, but that didn't justify what he had done. I loved you, Adrian, I said quietly. I loved you as best I could. Maybe not perfectly, maybe too strictly. But everything I did was to make sure you grew up to be a strong, honest man. A man who knows right from wrong. A man who wouldn't steal from his own father. We didn't steal, Adrian said stubbornly. We just borrowed the diary. to understand you better. Give it back, Anusurnam, I said. Today, and the house keys too. Adrian was silent, clearly unprepared for such a demand. Adrian, my voice hardened, did you hear what I said? Give back the diary and the keys. Otherwise, I'll report it to the police. You won't do that, he repeated, but without his previous confidence. Try me, I replied, looking him straight in the eye. We stared at each other for several long seconds, and I saw the emotions change in his eyes. Shock, anger, fear, and finally defeat. All right, he said finally. I'll return the diary. Today. And the keys, I reminded him. And the keys, he agreed reluctantly. Adrian stood up, clearly intending to leave. But before he reached the door, I stopped him. One more thing, Adrian. I'm changing the will. After everything that's happened, I can't leave things as they are. He turned slowly, his face a mixture of shock and hurt. What do you mean? I'm significantly reducing your share of the inheritance, I said bluntly. Most of my money will go to charity. The house will be sold, and the proceeds will also go to charitable foundations. Adrian looked at me as if he couldn't believe his ears. You can't do that, he said. It's not right. I can and I will, I replied. My lawyer is coming tomorrow, and I'm going to sign a new will. This is my decision, and it's final. This is because of Pearl, isn't it? Adrian's voice sounded desperate. Are you punishing me because of her? Because I chose a woman you don't like? No, Adrian, I shook my head. I'm doing this because of your own actions. Because you broke my trust, invaded my home, stole my personal belongings. And even now you can't admit that you did wrong. I did admit it, he exclaimed. I said we made a mistake. A mistake is when you do something unintentionally, I replied. What you did was intentional. You planned it. You deliberately asked me about the cameras, the keys, where I keep my documents. That's not a mistake, Adrian. It's betrayal. Adrian stood with his fists clenched, his face red with anger and hurt. You've always been like this, he said finally. Harsh, unforgiving, incapable of forgiveness. You couldn't even forgive Mom for dying and leaving you alone. It wasn't fair, and he knew it. Agatha was the love of my life, and her death broke my heart. But I wasn't going to stoop to that level of discussion. The diary and the keys, Adrian, I repeated. Today. And on that note, I think our conversation is over. Adrian stood there for a few more seconds, looking at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. A mixture of anger, disappointment, and perhaps, somewhere deep down, pain at the realization that our relationship was finally over. Then he turned and left without saying another word. The return home was more difficult than I had expected. Physically because of my still painful hip, which forced me to rely on a walker instead of my usual cane. Emotionally, because I knew my home had been violated by the intrusion, and that changed my attitude toward it. The taxi pulled up to the driveway at exactly 10 o'clock. The visiting nurse, Mrs. Coleridge, a plump, middle-aged woman with a kind face and strong hands, helped me out of the back seat and waited patiently while I got used to standing with the walker. Take your time, Mr. Travers, she said in a calm, professional tone. We have the whole day ahead of us. I nodded, grateful for her patience, though inside I was consumed with impatience. I wanted to get inside as soon as possible, to see with my own eyes what had changed and what remained the same. Slowly, step by step, we made our way along the path to the front door. The autumn wind rustled the last leaves on the trees, and the sky was covered with gray clouds. It seemed as if nature itself was reflecting my mood. The key that Adrian had returned through the security company turned easily in the new lock. The door opened, and I stepped into the hallway of my home for the first time in 3 weeks. The first thing that struck me was the perfect order. Everything was in its place, every surface gleaming with cleanliness. Walter had taken care of everything, hiring a cleaning service before my return. But despite the immaculate surroundings, I felt that something had changed. It was as if the very air in the house had changed. What a beautiful house, Mrs. Coleridge remarked as she helped me take off my coat. Spacious and bright. Thank you, I replied automatically, looking at the hallway through the eyes of a stranger. She was right. The house was indeed beautiful, but now it seemed to me like a museum, an exhibition of a past life, rather than a living, breathing space. Let's make you comfortable, Mrs. Coleridge suggested. The living room or the bedroom? Which would you prefer? I thought for a moment. The bedroom would be the logical choice. I could rest there. But the thought of Pearl sitting on my bed, reading my diary, touching things that belonged only to me and Agatha? No, I wasn't ready to go back there right away. The living room, I said. I'd like to sit in my chair. Mrs. Coleridge nodded and helped me across the hall into the spacious living room, flooded with morning light streaming through the large windows. My favorite chair stood by the fireplace, as always, but for some reason it seemed unfamiliar. I wondered if Pearl had sat in it. Had she searched it in its surroundings for something valuable? I slowly sank into the chair, trying not to wince from the pain in my hip. Mrs. Coleridge placed a pillow behind my back and asked if I wanted tea. I agreed, and she withdrew to the kitchen, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I looked around the living room, noting details I had seen hundreds of times before, but which now seemed different. The bookshelves filled with volumes on law and classical literature, the fireplace above which hung Agatha's portrait, the desk in the corner where I often worked in the evenings. Everything was in its place, and yet something was wrong. It took me a few minutes to realize what it was. The feeling of security was gone. This house used to be my fortress, a place where I felt protected from the outside world. Now I knew returning home, the emotional strain of the past few weeks and physical pain all took their toll. The sound of Mrs. Coleridge's footsteps brought me back to reality. She handed me the tablet and said she would be in the kitchen unpacking the groceries that had been delivered that morning. I thanked her, and when she left, turned on the tablet. The first thing I did was check the cameras. They were all working properly, showing the empty rooms of the house. This check had become a kind of ritual for me since I saw Pearl's intrusion. Then I opened my email. Several messages from Walter informing me that the will had been changed and the locks replaced. One from Dr. Pearson reminding me of my appointment in a week. Nothing from Adrian. He hadn't tried to contact me since our last conversation at the hospital. The diary and keys had been returned through intermediaries. The diary had been given to the nurse at the hospital, and the keys had been sent to the security company. No notes, no calls, no messages. It was as if an invisible barrier had grown between us that no one dared to cross. I put down my tablet and picked up a cup of tea that was already starting to get cold. The taste was familiar and yet strange, like everything else in this house now. The day dragged on slowly. Mrs. Coleridge helped me take a shower and get dressed, then insisted on a light lunch, which I barely touched. After lunch, I did the exercises prescribed by the physical therapist under her watchful eye. All the while, my gaze kept returning to the phone on the table in the hall. I was waiting for a call, though I didn't know from whom or why. By evening, it had started to rain. The raindrops drummed on the windows, creating a cozy background noise that had always calmed me in the past. Mrs. Coleridge prepared dinner, a simple but nutritious soup and toast, and insisted that I eat at least a little. Then she helped me move to the bedroom, where I could rest before going to sleep. The bedroom remained the same as I remembered it, but now I looked at it with different eyes. I knew that she nodded, wished me good night, and retired to the guest room on the first floor, which was now hers while she worked for me. I lay in the dark, listening to the sound of the rain and staring at the ceiling. My thoughts swirled around the events of the past few weeks, returning again and again to the moment I saw Pearl entering my house, to the look on her face as she read my diary, to my conversation with Adrian in the hospital, his inability to admit his guilt, his accusations against me. Maybe he was right about some things. Maybe I really was too harsh, too demanding as a father. Maybe I never really tried to understand him, to accept him for who he was. But did that justify what he did? Did that give him the right to break into my house, rummage through my personal belongings, steal my diary? I closed my eyes, feeling fatigue finally overcome my anxious thoughts. The last thing I remember before falling asleep is the image of Agatha smiling at me from a photograph on the bedside table. The morning brought bright sunlight and unexpected relief from the pain in my hip. Perhaps, however, my plans were not meant to be. Around 11 in the morning, the phone rang. Mrs. Coleridge answered it and then brought the receiver to me, saying that my son was calling. I felt my whole body tense up. I had been both waiting for and dreading this call. Taking the phone, I took a deep breath, preparing myself for a difficult conversation. Gilbert Travers, I said in a formal tone, as if answering a call at the office rather than talking to my own son. Dad, Adrian's voice sounded tense. I heard you were discharged. How are you feeling? Fine, I replied curtly. Thanks for your concern. There was a pause during which I could almost physically feel the tension permeating the phone line. Dad, you're punishing me for one mistake, erasing our whole life together, all the years I was a good son. A good son? I couldn't hide the bitterness in my voice. A good son doesn't break into his father's house while he's in the hospital. He doesn't search his things or steal his personal diary. And he certainly doesn't lie to his face when he's caught doing it. I've already apologized for that, Adrian said. We returned the diary and the keys. What more do you want? True remorse, I replied. An admission that what you did was wrong? Not a mistake or a misunderstanding, but a deliberate violation of my personal space and trust. God, Dad, you sound like a judge, not a father, Adrian exclaimed. Always these high standards, always these accusations. Yes, we did wrong. Yes, I regret it. But why can't you at least try to understand us? Understand why we did it? Enlighten me, I said, keeping my cool. Why did you do it? Because you were never honest with us, Adrian replied, his voice tinged with long-standing resentment. You always hid your true thoughts and feelings. You always kept your distance, even from me, your only son. We never knew what you really thought of us. And yet, it was a trait reinforced by years of working in court, where emotions were considered a weakness and decisions had to be based solely on facts and the law. If you wanted to know what I thought, you could have just asked, I said. As if you would have answered honestly, Adrian said with a bitter smile. Dad, you never told me I wasn't good enough for you. You never directly criticized Pearl. You just kept us at a distance. You looked at us with that judgmental expression of yours, and we never knew what was going on in your head until we read the diary. I paused, digesting his words. Maybe he was right. Maybe my inability to openly express my feelings and thoughts had indeed contributed to this situation. But that didn't change the essence of what had happened. Even if you're right about something, Adrian, I finally said, it doesn't justify what you did. Invading someone's home, someone's private life, is not the way to solve problems. It's a crime, not only legally, but morally. As always, law and morality, Adrian sighed. Never anything personal, never anything human. You know, Dad, Pearl was right about you. You're not capable of a real relationship. Only judgments and verdicts. His words hurt, but I didn't let it show. If you're only calling to insult me, then I don't think we have anything more to talk about, I said flatly. No, that's not why I'm calling, Adrian replied quickly. I was hoping we could work this out somehow. Find a way to move on. You're the only father I have. And despite everything, I don't want to lose you. There was sincerity in his voice that made me question my decision for a moment. But then I remembered the look on Pearl's face when she read my diary, the cold calculation with which she searched my house, and my resolve returned. We can only move forward on the basis of truth and trust, Adrian, I said. And those have been destroyed, not by me, but by you and Pearl. What you wrote about her in your diary, is it true, Adrian asked suddenly? That she married me for money? That she manipulates me? I could have lied. I could have said that these were just the thoughts of an angry old man, that I didn't mean any of it literally. That might have softened the situation, given us a chance at reconciliation. But I had lived too long by the principle that the truth, however bitter, is always better than a comforting lie. Yes, it's true, I said firmly. That's really how I feel about Pearl, and nothing that has happened in the last few weeks has convinced me otherwise. On the contrary, her actions have only confirmed my opinion. There was a long pause. I could almost physically feel my words traveling through the phone line, reaching Adrian, causing him pain that I didn't want to cause, but couldn't prevent without lying. I see, Adrian finally said, his voice cold and distant. Well, at least now I know what you really think. And you know what, Dad? You're wrong. Pearl loves me. She supports me in ways you never did. She sees the good in me, not just my mistakes and flaws. If you say so, I replied, not wanting to argue. I knew it was useless. Adrian was blinded by his feelings for Pearl, and nothing I could say would change that. So that's how it's going to be? Adrian asked after another pause. You're just going to cut me out of your life? Because of one mistake. I'm not cutting you out, Adrian, I said. You made your own choice when you decided to help Pearl break into my house, when you decided to lie to me about it, when even now you can't admit that it was wrong. Hypocrite, Adrian spat, his voice trembling with anger. You talk about truth and trust, but you've been hiding your true thoughts and feelings for years. You judge us for wanting to know the truth, but you don't judge yourself for hiding it. I have a right to my personal space and my personal thoughts, Adrian, I replied, trying to remain calm. Like anyone else. And no one, neither you nor your wife, has the right to violate that space. You know what? Adrian said after a short pause. You're right. There's no point in continuing this conversation. You won't pain? Yes, I replied, surprised that my voice sounded firm and confident. Everything is fine. Just family matters. She nodded understandingly, without asking any further questions, and returned to the kitchen. I remained alone in the living room, in a house that had once been filled with life and happiness, but now seemed like an empty shell of the past. My gaze fell on Agatha's portrait above the fireplace. I often talked to her after her death, telling her about my thoughts, doubts, and fears. Now I wanted to talk to her too, to ask if I had done the right thing, if I had been too harsh with Adrian. But Agatha was gone, and only I could answer those questions. Perhaps I really had been too harsh a father, too demanding, too stingy with praise and approval. Perhaps my inability to openly express my feelings did contribute to the alienation between Adrian and me, creating the rift that Pearl so easily exploited for her own benefit. But I also knew that there was a line that could not be crossed. There are principles that cannot be violated, even for the sake of loved ones. And Adrian crossed that line, violated those principles. I couldn't outside because it was the right decision, the only one I could make while remaining true to myself. The rain intensified, turning into a real downpour. I listened to its sound, looking at Agatha's portrait, and felt a strange calmness. The calmness of a man who had paid a high price, but had not strayed from his principles. He had not betrayed himself, and in that was his own bitter victory.